My name is Bambang Harimurti. I'm very happy today to be the moderating this special event, which is asking question whether the superpower can get along. Of course, that probably be an oxymoron question, right? Because a superpower can get along if only one of them, right? But now we have quite a few of them because we have the rise of China. So United States maybe felt a bit threatened. We still have the old power during the Cold War from Russia, at that time called Soviet Union. Even older empire, Pax Britannica, we have representative here from England. And of course, we also have, at one time, a country that has I think the highest GDP per capita at one point, right? Japan, right, in the 80s, who were now also kind of assert itself more in the international fora. But before I ask them to come up to talk here, first I would like to ask all of you, among you, who think the superpower is acting more aggressively than they should? Who? Okay. Who actually think that they are less aggressive? Oh, not a little bit. So the rest is don't know, right? Okay, who doesn't have an opinion on this? Very interesting. So some of you actually have opinion but don't want to raise your hand, right? Okay, I understand that. Okay. Now, let me ask you another question from Pak Dino here. Do you think any superpower exists now that actually want to have a world peace? No? Anyone? Yeah, can you give me can you say why you think so? Yeah. Why you think so?
I think the superpower that aims to create world peace right now, the closest one is China because of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Oh, okay. Anyone want to challenge that? Okay, here's one.
I think the world peace is subjective according to each nation, such as one says the world peace is only based on Western democracy, while the other one says, oh, the world peace is based on passiveness or pacifist, or another one says world peace is when human no longer exists. However, it's very subjective across the world, especially based on the human histories. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll give a clap of hands, yeah? Oh, you want to speak too? Now you want to speak. Okay.
I'm sorry, but I agree with him. Somehow the concept of world peace and world order is somewhat subjective. And what makes the conflict between great power exist is because they have very different perspectives and actually conflicting with each other. For example, the concept of outlook that has been proposed by the United States is actually conflicting with Belt and Road Initiative. They have their own version of order, world order, but somehow it's conflicting with each other. Therefore, it creates a competition between each other. Thank you.
So you believe competition is good, yeah? Okay, that reminds me of a letter between two old friends, Alfred Nobel and his former secretary, a lady. It's very interesting. The lady went to be a nurse in the war of Crimean, I think. And she found so many suffering, so she led an organization of peace called Lay Down Your Arm and asked to campaign for all countries to lay down their arms in order to achieve peace. And she has a debate with her former boss, Alfred Nobel, who actually both agreed they need a world peace, but the way to achieve it is very different. Actually, Alfred Nobel said, no, you're wrong. Everybody, in order to get world peace, not that all countries has to lay down arms, but each country has to have such a powerful arm that nobody dare to use it. And of course, as Thomas Jefferson says, where you stand depends on where you sit, right? Because Nobel created a dynamite, and he make his business from selling explosive. So he's saying that if each country has nuclear bomb, then there would be no war, because who would be crazy enough to stage a war between each other? But of course, this is a dangerous thinking, but not without good argument behind it. But I'm not so smart enough to think about this thing compared to the 4 speakers we have. So we are going to call them to sit in front. The first one is Mr. Jonah Blank. Yeah, he's a former congressional staff and senior political scientist from RAND Corporation. He will represent Americans, but not United States of America government, but American voice, okay? Please sit down. And then I'm going to call also another person with a very famous name in the US, but actually from British, Mr. Tom Cargill. He's an executive chair of British Foreign Policy Group. Yes, please. Yeah, and you remember at one time we have Pax Britannica, yeah? But now it's a Brexit time, so you can ask him. And of course, we are also very lucky. We have Mr. Anton Bespalov, executive editor of Valdai Club, from Russia with love. Yeah. And now, of course, we have a very good friend. If in my generation, we have a famous film called the what you call it? Something with The Last Samurai. Yeah. So we have one of the Last Samurai here, Professor Ken Jimbo. Yeah. Senior Research Fellow from Cannon Institute for Global Studies. Okay, but before I ask them question, I want to ask you again. Who think that China and US will have a better relationship soon? Okay, only very few. Who think that it will get worse? Oh, much more. And who you think it will remain the same? Okay. And who think you don't know what will happen? Okay, very good, very honest. And now I would like to ask you, we start the American, following this question. Do you think US and China relationship will get better?
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
first off, I'd just like to say, terima kasih telah mengundang hari ini. Saya pikir kita akan rukun karena saya pikir kita harus rukun. I think that we will get along better because we must get along better. So, inshallah. Yes.
American radical nih. Okay, but let me ask you, do you think that US and China is on the verge of technological race? Because, you know, everybody, who has Huawei phone like me? Who has iPhone? Well, see, do you think it's going to get a...
Well, yes, we're in a technological race right now, and iPhones are actually constructed in China. So the idea of one country owning any piece of technology is really becoming outdated, if it is not already outdated.
Yeah.
So I feel that the idea of a US-China trade war is ridiculous. I think it is not in the interests of the US, not in the interests of China. And I think that we're in a very odd moment in the US. I can talk about that more later. But over the long term, I think that the US and China do not have any predetermined course that makes it necessary that they be adversaries.
Okay, that's with China. What about with Russia, the old enemy? Is it going to become even a new enemy again? Or a new friends?
Well, I'll say something a little controversial, perhaps, and others may feel free to disagree with me. But Russia has already been taking aggressive actions towards American democracy. If you believe if you believe the Mueller report, if you believe the unanimous view of U.S. intelligence services, the U.S. election in 2016 was interfered with by hackers from Russia, and that this is still going on for the next election, for 2020. Our hands are not clean here because one of our two parties has apparently collaborated with this effort. So you can't really have a successful hacking operation without a collaboration of one of the two parties. I think this is a tremendously dangerous thing for America because without confidence in the democratic political process, American citizens lose all confidence in the legitimacy of government.
So maybe America is won the Cold War, but lose the election war.
Well,
okay.
Well, it's definitely not looking like, it's not feeling, I'll put it this way, I'm not tired of winning. That's sure.
Okay, thank you. Anton, I think you have to pick that up because obviously he thinks that U.S.-Russia relationship will get worse. Do you
Well,
think so?
if I'm not mistaken, the main finding of the Mueller report is that there was no collusion, there were no traces of collusion. There may have been, that was the result. Next, well, it's very, flattering to a Russian to know that we can influence an American election. Well, I don't think anyone in Russia or in China, for that matter, has the potential to do this tremendous job to undermine American democracy. And concerning the hackers, well, okay, it sounds good, we can hack an election. But in fact, what was found was several hundred Facebook accounts that may have been campaigning against Trump. But that is not a tool that you can undermine an election with. Sorry? Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I mean, you can pay for it just like Indonesian election? Okay. Well, it's, clearly here is, maybe the Cold War has ended, but clearly the warm peace is getting warmer here, right? Maybe it's something to do with global climate change. I don't know. And what actually is the Russian position on global climate change, since you produce a lot of the oil and gas?
Well, it is ambivalent, I must admit, but there is an interesting fact that due to economic recession, Russia's greenhouse emissions reduced significantly. So it was a natural development that pushed Russia into the camp of environmentalists, the environmentalist group of countries. This is why Russia supported the Paris agreements, which were done by Donald Trump later.
You want to take that on it? Yeah.
I am thrilled and applaud Russia and Indonesia and every other country that supports the Paris climate change agreements. I, like most Americans, oppose Donald Trump taking us out of these agreements.
Thank you very much. Do you notice that while these two are bickering, the Britons keep their cool and like this, yeah? And I wonder whether this is because the British is doing something. But is it true that actually the American government and the British government and many European countries are actually blaming Russia more for the worst global situation in terms of the peace getting warmer?
Well, I'm just flattered to be on the panel, frankly. And I feel, Chair, you're being mischievous slightly in creating division between us. I can understand why. Certainly in terms of, well, my view, and I think it's a view shared by many others in the UK, is that actually Russia is not a huge threat to global peace and stability. Russia is being unhelpful in a number of respects, but it's unhelpful in the context of a world order that's already fractured and in decline, and in a way Russia is just following the logic of trying to leverage its own national interests, recognizing that global system is in decline. I think the job for all of us who value world peace and world stability is to recognize that decline and work together to actually put in place a system that better reflects the world order as it is in 2020, not as it existed back in 1945.
Is that why British is not usually the Brits are following the US, right? Policy, especially regarding other countries. But in terms of the 5G, Huawei, the British is not really following the US. Why is that?
Well, there's been no decision made yet on Huawei. There's arguments for and against allowing Huawei to participate in aspects of the UK's critical infrastructure, and my understanding is at present that the view on balance is that it would be right to allow Huawei to invest in certain aspects, and that the UK has rigid enough security systems to allow that to happen in a way which would not put at risk our critical, the core of our critical infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you off the hook for a while now because I'm afraid Mr. Kenji will do something in silence otherwise. So, so Mr. Kenji, in Japan also is the same question for me with the British. Usually Japan, you know, becoming the deputy sheriff of the US in terms of global foreign policy. But now it seems that Japan is building a better relation with Russia and China when actually US has a worse relation with them. What happened here? Is Japan doing a policy of, we call it Indonesia selingkuh?
I would say that if you imagine what happened in like 10, 15 years ago, Japan is considered to be one of the toughest actor to confront with the rise of China. And everybody else says, well, you're going too far. We are doing an engagement policy. United States pursuing a responsible stakeholder. And Japan is doing what? Totally denying the rise of China in Asia? Well, what's the choice for us? But now, what you see is the United States has been adopting the comprehensive strategic competition with China, not only the security, but on the trade, technologies, Huawei, get rid of Huawei and everything that you have to follow. And Japanese answer is, well, you're going too far. You know, we've been doing the strategic competition for decades. That's fine with that. But in terms of the economy, the reality lies in that our business communities are investing so much in China. Our production and value chains are spread around the Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and then finally assemble in China. That's the huge ecosystem that we have in Asia. So if the United States asks us to decouple all the economic engagements with China, that's not the reality for Japan as well. So we are the conditional deputy sheriff of the United States. Security-wise, we shared a lot of goals, how to maintain the deterrence, force posture, and so on. But on the economic activity, I think everybody have a different playing book, how to deal with it. So we are inviting President Xi Jinping to come to Japan in April, and I think that there will be a lot of collaboration on the economy going on. That's on the China. Yeah. And Russia, I don't know, the current government negotiation seems to be not working well. I don't think the islands will be returned. But thing is, we don't have a luxury to have two potential enemies at the same time. And the last thing we want to have is that China and Russia aligned together with every strategic issue they face in Asia. And the Japanese humble strategic plan is how to split the Russia and China in their Asian engagement. And the Russia wants that too. They want to engage in Asia, but not always through China, right? So that Japan could be, or ASEAN could be, the excellent actor to directly engage. And then we want to create the Russia to have its own independent interest in Asia. And that will complicate the calculation of China. That's our game plan. I don't know if that will be successful.
Thank you very much. But Anton, isn't it that Russia game plan is to make sure that China and Japan not too close together and ganging up on you, right?
Well, it's not in Russia's interest to have any kind of enmity in Asia. So it's building a strategic partnership with China. It has improved significantly its relations with Japan. So seeing Russia as an ally of China would be wrong, because Russia is interested in non-bloc Asia. So the way it works on a better relationship with China does not harm Japan's interests, just as well as its more engagement with Japan, but the extent of this engagement depends to Japan to a large extent, and moreover, to its strategic relations with the United States is not intended to weaken China, or weaken its positions in Asia.
So what Russia's response to the Belt Initiative, One Belt Initiative?
Russia embraced this initiative because it also has development strategy. In this sense, it shares a lot of goals with other Asian countries. We see Russia as an Asian country here. So the Belt and Road can be aligned with Russia's own plans of Eurasian integration, which is taking place on the Eurasian space, specifically in Central Asia. And Russia hopes to harness the potential of China to develop its own Far Eastern regions and ensure a better economic environment in Central Asia, which is Russia's soft underbelly and strategically important region for it.
Now I'm back to Japan again. I remember Japan used to have this theory of flying geese, right? Yeah. Japan is the biggest duck in front, and China behind, and Taiwan, and the tigers, and so on. But it seems now the one geese, China is now want to be in front and Japan in the back. Is Japan willing to do that?
I think that if you look at the production value chains in Asia, it certainly is going beyond the so-called the flying geese model, because the flying geese is from the low-value products like a textile to the heavy industry and then to the more high-tech industry, that if you have a standardized production mechanism, you can actually transfer those production mechanism to the more like a favorable production system, which has a low labor cost and something. But now, as you mentioned about the iPhone things, it is so complicated to get the raw materials of, medium products and the final assembly system, and then you have the sales technology and provision of the services, and I think that has become too much complicated. Who could be really leading the process on one thing? Obviously, China wants to have its own internal eco-dynamic system as well, but that also has to rely on some of the components of the United States, like a Qualcomm and the semiconductor system, and Google service to Huawei. So it's heavily interdependent. In terms of that, I think that the manufacturing mindset of the flying geese is no longer the story of the Asian economy.
Oh, so it's discarded now, the flying geese. Okay.
I mean, and Japan, for example, I live in Thailand right now, and I visited many of those so-called Japanese multinational investment sites. And if the flying geese model applies, those factories could be, transplanted in Myanmar or Cambodia. But it is never happening, because the social capital of the investment environment that Thailand provides is so strong, so that the company wish to upgrade its production from the normal gasoline engine to the high-tech engine to be produced in Thailand. Those are the kind of new investment style of the Japanese company.
Thank you. It's very interesting to me that both Japanese and Russian thinking the way to a greater world peace is by making everybody connected through a value chain, right? So there are no longer made in Japan, made in China, but made in by the world, right? Because nothing is really altogether made in one country, which used to be the mantra of the Western country by the US and British. But now, even England want to get out of Europe with Brexit. What happened? Why is the word topsy-turvy round now? You used to be for, I remember Pax Britannica used to be, we have to have a freedom of navigation, of free trade and everything. And now suddenly you want, no, I don't want free trade. I want to be alone. Leave me alone. Why?
Yeah, good question. And there's lots of very complicated domestic as much as international reasons why UK voted for Brexit, and I should say domestic and social reasons that have counterparts in other parts of the world, including the US, including other parts of Europe, perhaps even including here. I have to say, though, that one of the things that's really been remarkable to me since we voted to leave, and talking to ambassadors and diplomats from other countries around the world, is that they're actually tending to be saying, welcome back. We're keen to do more trade with you. We're glad that your horizons are lifting beyond just the EU. And however successful it was, and however regretful I am in many ways that we are leaving the EU, there is some sense, which I think the public picked up on, that the political elite in the UK had become, over recent decades, ever more focused on Brussels and European issues, very critical, very real issues, but that happened at the expense of a wider horizon and a wider set of relationships that, particularly now, as we move towards the Asian century and the centre of gravity shifting to this part of the world, the UK really needs to be able to refocus and move forward on the basis of some different relationships. I hope that won't come at the cost of our relationships in Europe, although there will be some short-term turbulence. But I see this as a rising of our horizons, not a lowering, if we get it right.
But are you worried if this is something like happen everywhere, that we are going back to a situation just before the First World War, where everybody want to become mercantilist, protectionism, and then we end up with a world war? Are you worried that this might be recurring themes now?
I do worry about the emergence of blocs. I worry, actually, I mean, we go back to the beginning of the conversation. It's not so much China or the US deploying hard power, force that worries me in the short term. What I'm really concerned about is a competition between sets of standards and regulations and approaches to data. Because at the moment we are seeing the emergence of three great competing standards and regulatory processes, and these standards and regulatory processes are things that define, they're the kind of metadata for the world, if you like, how buildings are built, how chemicals are made, how food is labeled before it's exported, everything around us. And you combine that with the way that data is handled, where it's stored, the language that it's written in, who can access that. You're seeing a growing competition between a US, a European, and a Chinese set of standards, and that could be very dangerous to future growth of the world if everyone else is forced to fit into one of these three blocks at the exclusion of the other.
So this is mercantilism part 2, or because it's sort of like a neo-mercantilism for me, access to data and all this stuff, right?
That's certainly the risk, unless the rest of us who aren't a part of these three big blocks start to coordinate more effectively to be able to ensure that there's a free flow of standards and a more kind of global approach to it.
Yeah. Okay, now back to the US. I remember, and this is Pak Dino Jalal asked me to ask this question because he loved Graham Allison's book on, during the Cuban crisis. We survived the Cold War, but barely actually. Imagine if, it went wrong during the Cuban crisis. Do you think it's possible that something as dangerously close thing like that will happen again because of China and US relationship? Because both countries have a lot of nuclear bomb, right? More than enough to destroy the whole world, actually.
I am very concerned about the possibility of man-made apocalypse. But I would say that the nuclear scenario is only one of the possible scenarios, and it's not even the one that frightens me the most. We've had over half a century of figuring out how to deal with nuclear weapons, and every power that has nuclear weapons, with the possible exception of North Korea, is pretty experienced in how to use them. Of the possibilities of nuclear war, I would say India-Pakistan is the most likely, although a case could be made of North Korea with any of 3 different countries. But what I really am more afraid of are next generation threats. Things like cyber warfare, which we just don't understand how to fight yet. A lot of the work that I do at the RAND Corporation deals with helping the Pentagon figure out not only how to fight wars, but how to not fight wars. And a lot of that is just trying to figure out what you do. Nobody knows how to fight a cyber war. And when you combine that with artificial intelligence, AI, it becomes a really frightening thing. The more I learn about AI, the more I think the only way that we can save humanity is for John Connor to send Kyle Reese back in time and destroy Skynet before it goes live. For those of you who haven't seen The Terminator, go see it. Add to that the threat of climate change, the threat of natural disasters such as tsunamis, volcanoes, pandemics. The fact that all of this feeds on each other, that the more you have population explosions of migrants, the more that you have a risk of war, the more that you have a risk of pandemic, the more that you have an incentive for governments to impose oppressive policies, like we're seeing with the Uyghurs in China. And all of these things, I think, make the world a much more dangerous place than simply a nuclear scenario alone.
Thank you.
Sorry to be a downer.
Okay. Yeah, anyone comment? Yeah, I can, if anyone wants to comment. Okay, can you come up here? Yeah, yeah. You know, come here. So we can all see you. Yeah. And say your name, yeah? How you want to ask it?
Hello, my name is Daniel Ananda from Parahyangan Catholic University International Relations. First, I want to ask you a question for Jonah Hill from the RAND Corporation. Why did the RAND Corporation made a journal earlier this year called Russia is a Rage, Not a Peer, China is a Peer, Not a Rogue? Why? I mean, it seems that it is seen that United States sees Russia as a threat, but for the shorter term, but China as not a threat like now, but a threat for the longer term. Why is like that? I think there are still 2 questions.
Oh, okay.
Very good question. We should have a clap hand or camera. Okay, later on, okay? Don't get too greedy. Later on. Okay, please.
Good question. First, I should just note I can't speak for my RAND colleagues because there are nearly 1,000 RAND researchers, and we don't all sort of sit at RAND Central and plot world domination, despite what people may. Yes. So I'll answer on the basis of what I think that report might say, while making clear that I'm not speaking for the report's authors. I think that the argument is probably that in the short term, right now, the U.S. is at a political risk from Russia for the reasons I mentioned before. The hacking of the U.S. election in 2016, and I can talk more about that, but it is the universal view of the American intelligence community that actors within Russia deliberately interfered with the U.S. election in hopes of electing Donald Trump as president, and that this is going on for the 2020 election as well. Maybe that's correct, maybe that's incorrect, but it's certainly the almost universally held view among the professionals in the United States who follow this. However, for the longer term, the widely held view in both military and intelligence circles is that the U.S. doesn't really have a whole lot to fear from Russia in conventional terms. In conventional military terms, the U.S. is more of a peer competitor or faces a pure competition threat from China than from Russia. And in the economic sphere, it's not even close. China is the only peer competitor that the U.S. has. So that at least is my interpretation of what the report would have been saying.
Yeah, I think Anton probably better say something about this.
Well, again, concerning U.S. intelligence community, I wouldn't call it a reliable source, considering how it trumped up the accusations against Iraq in 2003, saying it had the weapons of mass destruction, which it did not have. But okay, you trust your intelligence community. That's what you're supposed to do.
I should respond on that. The U.S. intelligence community actually called the Iraq threat more correct than incorrect. I know because I was in government at the time. Anyone who thought that Iraq had nuclear weapons or biological weapons was not reading the intelligence. I was. So was everyone in the Bush administration who decided to go to war. Why was there this confusion? Because of political choices, the political choices of the Bush administration. The intelligence was actually quite clear. The intelligence actually did not say that Iraq had nuclear or biological weapons. It said that it did have chemical weapons, which until recently it had, but those would have been no threat whatsoever unless the US invaded. So it was a failure of courage on the part of the intelligence community not to stand up to the politicians and say, no, you are misrepresenting what the intelligence says. If you want to go to war, but don't claim that Saddam Hussein has a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon.
Okay. Okay, so you are absolved from your sin. No, usually if you talk about intelligence, the British supposed to have a very good intelligence, but the British at that time also said there was a weapon of mass destruction in Iraq, right? You remember?
Yes, I do, and there's been a whole inquiry about it since, which I'm not an expert on, but you can go and look at the literature and see the mistakes that the government recognised were made. It's actually a very honest report that wasn't really covered very well in the UK press at the time because we were going through the referendum, but when the report on the mistakes that UK intelligence made in the Gulf War came out, I recommend you go and read it. It's very, very honest about the problems that happened. I don't personally think that it's really comparable with the weight of evidence that there is, unfortunately, about Russian interference in the US election. Having said that, I don't believe that it's possible to blame external forces entirely for what happened in the States. And if there hadn't been the strength of frustration amongst many ordinary American voters about the direction that the country had taken in recent years, and the very real support that there was for Donald Trump and the break from the norm that his campaign represented, I don't think any kind of external interference would have been successful.
Okay. Thank you. I'll give you now a very low-ball question to all of you. Remember early in the morning, if you were in the morning, Pak Dino Jalal actually gave this 16 cases of the reign of a superpower being challenged by a rising superpower. And of the 16, I think 12 ended up in war, right? And now we are in, many people say now is probably Pax Americana is being challenged by Pax China, something like that. So in your expert mind, since you are all expert on this, what should be done in order to make this number 17 cases end up in peace, like how Pax Britannica, and changed by Pax Americana? That was a peaceful process, right? How to make this, the future, the near future, actually also peaceful and not ended by war like the 12 cases of them? Yeah, you can.
Sure. Well, I think the most effective way is not by any one nation, but by all nations together, by upholding international law, international norms, institutions like the United Nations, alliances that are trying to keep peace rather than fight wars. And I must admit that the greatest threat to that type of structure that I've just described could fairly be said to be coming from my country at the moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think that we actually, in a strange way, need to look to some of the social changes that came out through Brexit, through the election of Donald Trump, through the protests that we're seeing in South America and the Middle East and elsewhere. All of this, to me, points to a growing kind of frustration, but also combined with a sense of empowerment from ordinary people, ordinary communities around the world. And what we need to do collectively is work to empower those communities with information. It's not by cutting people off from a source of information. We've got to get the accurate, the correct, the well-resourced information to them. And actually, it's not going to come from the great powers themselves. I think this global change in the international order that we need, it's going to come from countries all around, including Indonesia, including countries like South Africa, Colombia, Mexico, Korea, and that change has to come through these countries' citizens, actually. And that's why I think the role of all of you who are studying, who are aware of international issues, is going to be absolutely vital if we are to avoid another great power clash. This has to come from the bottom, not from the top.
Okay, thank you. Anton?
I totally agree with Tom on that. We need new players, new empowered great powers, which are now only emerging. But the more great powers in economic and political sense we have, the safer world we're likely to receive. But let me add some gloom. I believe we don't fully understand the level of threats that we'll be facing in a decade or so, because apart from the traditional military threats, there are now threats caused by cyber wars, caused by economic wars, because what we see, the actions of the Trump administration with his punishing friends and enemies alike with sanctions, this is probably an image of a new type of economic warfare. And I believe we need to find ways to regulate these relations, just as during the Cold War era we found ways to control the arms race. So, by the way, the arms control regimes are now eroding, and that's another danger. We should be looking for new ways to control the arms race, which may be unfolding soon in the Asia-Pacific. So we need to find new creative ways to tackle with new threats, and we have to start this work now.
Yeah.
I think we basically have two choices. First is to compete and win until China gives up. And I'm very skeptical to this idea. Some says it's a reason behind that, because if you look at the long-term economic projection studies, China is on the rise. United States is fine, but probably China may overtake the size of the GDP somewhere in 2026 to 2027 in terms of the nominal GDP. It's not a PPP, right? So, but the thing is, China will also be heavily challenged by the demography and also the production level, because rapidly they are aging, and the fiscal challenges are everywhere. They spend more money on the medical, social welfare, and not so much on the military. And then United States has a very exceptional demographic dynamics patterns. They have more immigration, not under the Trump administration, but it's a record of inviting a lot of foreign talents in the United States. That is the source of the high productivity and innovation in the United States. So if you have a more longer-term projection studies, China may overtake the United States and somewhere be, in 2027 or 8, but United States may overtake again in 2037, 8. And so it's a kind of H shape. It's like a kind of winding shape of the power transitions. So probably the Thukydides trap is a temporary one, and China will also face another Thucydides reverse draft, in the later stage. So it's a very dynamic processes. And then those people who want to struggle with China is let's resist in 2030s, and then the situation may change in the later 2037 or 8. Until then, we will maintain our international order until China may lose those kind of external pressures. That strategy may be rational, but we are in the stage of 2030 and live up with those competition while China is remaining in the trend of the becoming a great power, and that is too costly. And so the second choice we have is to accommodate. How do we accommodate? Out of those 16 cases, 12 cases ended up in the war, but remaining 4 cases, actually international system has been challenged significantly. They have to change the kind of how to provide the public goods and international order and so on. But how do we reform UN, IMF, G7, financial schemes? Those are the question, how much we can really accommodate with the growing powers in order to overcome the mismatch between the distribution of power and the institutional framework is the heavy challenge that we also need to consider.
Well, Professor Ken Jimbo, you seem to be a very wise man. Just imagine, I can imagine that Xi Jinping invited you and asked you to give advice. What should China do to have a better world?
I think China is a big country, and you need to have a good institutional slogans and mobilization policy. It's like a 4,000cc car. Once you started driving, you cannot really change the direction so easily. So I think it's very important to set the right strategy and right direction for China. And for China, it is very important that it's going to be a big power associated with global responsibility. It's not only internally targeted at China, but China also needs to provide the public goods to somebody else's benefit if you really want to share such kind of power with the United States.
Okay, and Mr. Anton, what would you say to Mr. Xi Jinping, your advice?
Well, I'm not in a position to give any recommendations to Xi Jinping. And even my president is not. He was asked the same question last year during a conference, said, no, okay, the Chinese will find their own ways how to tackle these challenges.
So no advice at all?
There are 2 things that you should not say in public: to discuss American domestic policies, because you will be immediately accused of meddling, and also about how to change China's course. It's an elephant, as someone called it, the big elephant in the room. It knows how to steer itself in the current changes.
Okay, I rephrase the question. What if Mr. Putin asks you to give advice to Mr. Xi Jinping? What would you say?
You wouldn't say no. Oh. Well, I think Mr. Putin has an idea of what the Russian-Chinese relationship looks like. Maybe he should recommend Mr. Xi to be more attentive to the needs of his neighbors, not to scare them too much, because that would be no good to anyone in Asia and Europe alike.
Boy, don't scare the bear, right? Good. Okay.
Don't
good
scare
policy.
the dragon.
The dragon, yeah, okay. Okay, and the British, the cool British, what would your advice to Mr. Xi Jinping?
Well, I think we're way past, we've got enough trouble with Brexit at the moment. I suppose, well, the lesson, have faith in your people. I think that's the thing. There's still a defensiveness, which I think is, I can understand why, but I think longer term, the interests of China are best served, and the interests of the world, by actually having faith in the Chinese people.
Okay. Now, if your RAND is hired by Xi Jinping and they send you to give the advice, what would you say?
Yeah, I as well would say trust in your people, because the Chinese experience over the past few decades is truly remarkable. It has gone from being a country with a very low standard of living to a country with a very high standard of living. The entire world's emergence from global poverty is mostly concentrated in China. And this has been a political decision, but it is a very incomplete political decision. As long as 1 million Uyghurs are detained for their practice of their own religion, as long as protesters in Hong Kong are denied their full rights, then China will never realize its true potential. I believe that when China actually has its politics catch up with the genius of its people, then we may be looking at a new world order in which my country is no longer even one of the top two.
Oh, okay. So basically you're saying, please have political liberation, not only economic, right?
My advice would be, if you have only economic liberation without political liberation, you're trapped continually having to provide more growth. In the US, we have some resilience because when times are bad, and let's face it, times are sometimes bad in the US, we at least have enough faith in our system that we feel we can get by. You know, as you may have noticed over the course of the past hour, I don't fully support every decision that the United States government has made recently. But that's my right as an American. And that's where a majority of the American people are. I believe that America will be okay in the long run. However, without that faith that the system can survive, then you're basically asking for another revolution.
Okay, thank you. This has come from a country who started the revolution with the Tea Party in Boston, right? That's why, you know, I want to close this down with something that I will give my friend here to sing, because I give a lot to my American friends. I said to them, look, you inspire us. You said no taxation without representation, right? So why not give the hardworking migrant in America, the green card holder, the right to vote? Why not? Oh. We end up with that because he needs a lot of time to think about it. Let's give applause to everybody. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'll give it back to the MC, but we want to take at selfie time, right? Now we have to... Q&A. Oh, sorry. We still have time for Q&A. Great. I want a lady. Who's a lady? Nobody want to claim that they are a lady? Okay, come lady from the back. Yeah, come forward, come forward. Yeah, come forward. Okay, here. Come here. We want to see you. Yeah, okay.
So, hello, my name is Hannah. Thank you for appointing me. So my question would be, do you think cosmopolitanism is relevant to creating the new world order for your country interest?
Sorry, cosmopolitan?
Cosmopolitanism.
Oh, cosmopolitanism. Anyone want to start answering that? Yeah?
So this is a big issue in the UK, so thank you very much for the question. And as you may know, that the UK is a very diverse society now, with people from who have roots all over the world. There has been a tension recently between the desire to accept and welcome and celebrate diversity, but also the need to have a sense of belonging and a sense of unity. I think in recent years, it's been much more towards diversity and a stronger kind of sense of cosmopolitan. Now we're coming back slightly to a sense of importance of integration, but you need a balance of both, and we're not there yet, I think.
Okay. I'll just add one thing to that. I think that diversity is a strength. Diversity is what makes America a successful country, what makes a country like India successful, and most importantly for where we are today, it is the greatest strength of Indonesia. Without Pancasila, Indonesia would not have survived as long as it has and will not be surviving as a great power for the future.
Okay, yes, thank you. Mr. Anton?
Well, I also believe that diversity is very important for any country to be successful. But what we see today is the rise of nationalism across the world, even in those societies which have had a high level of diversity and which nevertheless try to reverse this trend. So it depends on what you think as you speak about cosmopolitanism. If it's being open to other cultures, if it's about embracing cultures, faiths, customs. So I think it's a very creative way of transforming societies. And if it threatens your national identity, in many cases it may cause a backlash, which may be very dangerous.
Okay. Yes?
I myself, I'm a big fan of globalism. And especially when you have a social networks, your voices are connected with whoever who can plug and play into the system. And also, I was fan of the Libra. That's a Facebook kind of cryptocurrency system. And you don't need a bank account. You only have a kind of the transaction values. Whenever you want to buy something, you provide the services and you get paid from some kind of provision of the services and so on. And those kind of technological innovation are the basis of creating those cosmopolitan ideas. And then you can really practice day by day. Whenever you share the offices foreigners at your companies and your university, you are practicing like a cosmopolitan mindsets. And your friends' problems are your problem. And that really goes across the border. And those are the basis of the expansion of the sense of the we-ness. And if you try to build upon such things. And I think that the cosmopolitans mindset will be really spread through your practices as well.
Thank you. Are you satisfied with your answer?
Yes, thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you. Our cosmopolitan girls of the day. Okay, we need one more lady. Lady. You're not lady. Okay, any more lady? Oh, yeah, okay. Come here, don't be afraid. Okay.
So for the topic of great major powers getting along. So currently there's a proxy war between the US and Russia going on in Syria, in the Middle East, right? So how do you think you can solve this issue in terms of major powers getting along? And how do you ensure that the solutions given for, let's say, peacekeeping or just maintaining peace in general can work, especially knowing that Russia and US does not have like a smooth sailing history, let's say, especially with Cold War. How do you think you can ensure that peace is going to be maintained and assured? Thank you.
Anton, can you answer that?
Well, it's a tricky question because, as you know, recently Donald Trump ordered to withdraw American troops from Syria. And, being a Russian, I'm afraid of being accused again of meddling because some people really believe that Trump receives orders from Mr. Putin. But, well, it's my impression that that's how Trump is perceived in certain segments of American society. But I would not call Syria a proxy war between the United States and Russia, first of all, because there are many more players involved. These are Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Iran. So all of these states have more presence, including on the ground, than the United States does. So I think this is where the nascent great powers are active, and where, in this case, Turkey, because Turkey has aspirations to become one of the regional great powers. And it cooperates with Russia and Iran to solve its own security problems related to Kurds in Syria. So the situation on the ground in Syria today demonstrates that this approach seems to be working.
Okay. Well, I see that time is nearly up, so I would just say no matter what happens in great power competition, great powers and even less than great powers, as Anton has mentioned, will always try to use even smaller powers for their own ends. That's been going on throughout all of history and will continue going on throughout all of history. But one thing we've also seen, and people here in Indonesia know better than anybody else, is that when people of a country such as Indonesia stand together and say, we will not be pawns used by the great powers, they're able to succeed. Inshallah, in the future as well.
Non-blocks, yeah? Okay, thank you. Is satisfied for you? Oh, you can ask a little bit more, okay. More, what you don't want? Yeah, just 1 minute more, okay.
I'm
Yeah.
allowed to do that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Special for you. Paket telur.
So you mentioned that if major powers can use lesser powers for their own ends, that's also what a proxy war is. And how do you ensure that it's like, that's going to happen still, you said. And don't you think that this kind of competition is going to actually damage the existing fragile relationship between major powers? So that's going to even weaken the relationship between major powers. So how do you actually ensure that major powers will get along?
Okay.
Well, I think you never can guarantee that major powers will get along. There always will be competition. There always has been. You know, the challenge is keeping that competition from breaking into war, and in those cases where it does break into war, keeping it small war rather than a large war. I think it would be unrealistic to expect that great powers or second, third, fourth tier powers will not go to war with each other. They have in the past, they will in the future. The real challenge is making sure that conflict is managed, not that it's eliminated.
Okay. I think we need to have the British guy also, because Middle East is a legacy of British in the case of the war, right?
Okay, how am I going to do this? All right. Well, I think that what's happened in Syria is horrific and tragic. And my greatest regret is that the UK and the US and other countries actually failed to intervene when they did have the opportunity to make things better and reverse what has become an absolute slaughter in the country. I think Russia has stepped into the vacuum. It has chosen a different side from the side that the UK and US and others. They're supporting the regime that I believe in many ways was the reason for this catastrophe happening, but they did it because there was not sufficient support for those who were fighting for democracy and for a democracy that was free of extremism as well. So, you know, Russia again, I think, is filling a vacuum that others have left. The lesson I think we have to take is that we need a much more resilient, rules-based international system that's going to stand up when these atrocities take place, and we seem sadly very far from being there at the moment.
Anton, you want to take that a little bit?
Well, you kind of recognize that other states have to intervene in other states' affairs. So I think this is a very typical approach for the last quarter of the 20th century, which is, well, doesn't always work out well. So looking at the Syrian regime, what we have now is really a bad regime, which really was one of the reasons why this civil war ensued. But there were also foreign intervention in which, I mean, the support for the opposition groups, which was not always peaceful, which was always fighting for democracy, but there were elements of extremism there too. So what we have, I believe, is better what we had 2 or 3 or 4 years ago in Syria. I mean, a post-civil war situation is better than the slaughter that was there then.
Okay, I think from the non-direct participant major force, I think.
On the Syrian cases, I think it is a very bad combination of the spread of the Arab Springs, and that started with the resistance movement inside Syria, and that has been fueled by the foreign interventions. So it's many layers of the rivalries that really sacrifice the life of the people. So I don't really have a kind of magic solution or any kind of remedies could be made during the processes. But I once talked with Boutros Ghali in the late 1990s when I was very young, still young, but very young researchers. And why did you fail in the early stage of the peacekeeping, peace reconstruction processes when United Nations tried to offer so-called the Agenda for Peace in 1992? And then he revised a couple of years later. He said that major powers and external powers are not so conscious about the urgent needs to intervene at the earlier stage. And then they will mobilize all the resources and the force deployments when the things get very worse. But at least there has a huge risks that the people will be suffered by those intervention at that stage. So I think what we can learn the lesson from the Syria is that we will have to focus very seriously at the early stage of those disruptions of the societal order, and then those 100,000 of people probably had a chance to survive if we had a better kind of intervention strategy in Syria.
Thank you for your questions, and I think we will have to give applause to our speaker here, and also to everyone. And I think it's picture time. Right?